Good evening. My name is Bertie Pearson. I'm the rector of St. Albans Episcopal Church, and it is such a joy and privilege to welcome you all to the 2025 St. Albans Memorial Lecture. Before we jump in, I just want to say if you enjoy tonight's program, you should find 4 people. Their names are Rich, Leo, Amanda, and Gib, and they are entirely responsible for everything that's going on tonight. So bravo to you. I did miss one person who is also sort of responsible for tonight, but I'll tell you a little bit about him. So Dr. Francis Collins discovered many genes which led to producing therapies for genetic diseases. He led, of course, the Human Genome Project. He served as director of the National Institutes of Health from 2009 to 2021, serving under 3 presidents. He's a member of the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences, has received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the National Medal of Science, and of course he's probably best known for his extremely innovative novel guitar work in his band, the Affordable Rock Act, I believe? Rock and Roll Act, thank you. So, I know him, as you may, if you're not a scientist, from his phenomenal books. His work touches on science and philosophy, ethics, theology, and for my money, Dr. Collins is one of the few voices that can get us out of this morass of multilateral unkindness and despair. So, without further ado, Dr. Francis Collins.
Thank you, Bertie, for that very kind introduction, and good evening to everybody. I'm delighted to see you here at St. Albans. Been looking forward to the chance to share some thoughts with you and also to hear what questions you might have, because we're going to come to that a little later on, and you may have noticed there are index cards at your seats, which is where you can write down things that you might want to have included in the discussion when Bertie comes back up here and we have a chance for that kind of interaction. So, I guess what I'm going to try to explain to you is a little bit about the perspective for myself as a physician and a scientist and a follower of Jesus. And how does that all fit together? And how in particular does it shed any kind of useful light in the circumstances we find ourselves in right now, which I think we will all agree is a challenging and difficult time, with the amount of difficulties in being able to sit down and have civil conversations with each other when everything seems to be so polarized in our communities, including our churches. We're really struggling. And I'm struggling. So the title of the book that many of you were gracious enough to ask me to sign this evening may sound a little bit presumptuous, like I'm going to tell you the road to wisdom because I got it all figured out. I don't. I'm in the ditch half the time too. But maybe I've had some ideas about things that could be helpful, because they're helpful to me and really helpful to you, in trying to sort out how do we get ourselves back on a better path towards that goal that I think we all seek, which is really to acquire the kind of wisdom that we as humans are kind of designed to search for, but don't always find it so easy. And what is wisdom anyway? Is it the same as knowledge? No, it's more than that. It requires knowledge. It's hard to build wisdom on a foundation that's not full of truth and facts and evidence. But then on top of that, you have to add other things. You have to add such things as experience. Maybe common sense, but very importantly, a moral compass. Because knowledge itself doesn't necessarily carry that kind of moral implication. And it's up to us and the way in which we have been infused by God with this sense of morality to make sure that we're applying that part in order to get to the kind of wisdom that we are called to. And I can't say much about wisdom that comes close to what you can read about in Proverbs. So a lot of what I will tell you is a second and very much poor representation of what you can read in the Bible. I have a little joke about wisdom in terms of how you acquire it, because I'm this actually kind of spoke to me when I first heard it. There was a young man who was trying to find the source of wisdom, really having a hard time figuring out, how do I get that? And he would talk to various people, and they would give him answers that weren't very satisfying. And eventually, one of them said, well, there's that guy up there in the mountains, kind of a hermit, and this is his thing. And I bet if you went to talk to him, he would probably tell you what is wisdom. So the young man made his effort to try to get up there and see if he could figure out exactly what is the source of this. And he found the old man and said, please, sir, I'm desperate to know, what is the source of wisdom? How do I get wisdom? And the old man said, well, that's not so difficult. You just need good judgment. He wasn't sure that helped that much. He said, well, I don't know how to get good judgment. How do I get that? The old man said, well, simple. That's by experience. Well, okay, but I've had some experience, and I'm not sure it's helped me. How does experience get me there? This whole idea. He said, well, let me tell you how you get real wisdom. You have judgment, you have experience, and then you do some bad judgment, and then you've got wisdom. Not the case. The times where we really learn stuff is, as a scientist, I can tell you, it's the experiment that failed. That's the one where you really have to stop and think and go, oh, my hypothesis was really wrong, but this is a chance to leap into the next step. In the very first chapter of his book is my first spectacular scientific failure, where I learned so much, but I almost quit because I wasn't prepared for it. But there is, I guess, a lesson for me, maybe for many of us. So tonight I'm going to try to go through a few things. Whoops, this is jumping all around back up here. First, on a journey in science, because I think people are curious about that. How I came to be a Christian, because there's still a sense in many quarters that science and Christianity can't get along. They get along fine with me, and I'll tell you about that. I have to talk about COVID, because I think it's been such a critical part of how we have ended up in such a difficult place right now. Something about the current state of our nation, our world, some reflections on how we got here, didn't happen overnight, and some exhortations to all of us about how to find our way back. And then we'll have some Q&A with Bertie and all of you. So first, my own journey in science. Yeah, that's me. I was born on a small farm about 3 hours from here in Shenandoah Valley. That's me at the gate. That's our barn behind the house. And I was homeschooled until the 6th grade, but not for religious reasons. My parents didn't really have interest in faith. They had interest in theater and music and literature and ideas, and they were both extremely capable teachers. So they taught all 4 of their boys, and I'm the youngest, at home until various points. With me, we moved in town when I was 10 years old because my grandmother had a stroke and needed somebody in the house, and then I got to go to public school. So I had this wonderful experience of learning to love learning at my mother and father's feet, because that's what they conveyed to me as a kid about anything they were talking about. It was always interesting, and if it stopped being interesting, we would change to some other time. And then public school captured my imagination with science, and particularly a 10th grade chemistry teacher helped me understand that science is just this amazing detective story, that there's order to be discovered out there. And if you can apply the tools of science in a careful way and be rigorous about it and critical of your own data, you can discover stuff that weren't known before. Why wouldn't you want to do that? I wanted to do that. Oh yeah, and I also had to pick up something to make me less of a geek, and so I became a guitar player at the time, although I'm not sure how successful it was, because I was 2 years younger than everybody in my class, and so I was a little bit of a social outcast, but maybe that's not so good. So I went to chemistry as the place that must be calling to me, because that was the first thing that really got me excited. I kind of assume maybe many of you or your kids or your grandkids also think the thing that's exciting in class is the thing I should do. Maybe. Maybe not. So I went to University of Virginia, wonderful school, majored in chemistry, loved it. went off to graduate school at Yale in physical chemistry, of course. And I loved that too. It was all about quantum mechanics. My experience as a PhD student was mostly computer programming and also trying to solve really thorny second-order differential equations that were basically unsolvable, but you knew it was going to be great if it worked someday. But I was in a department of chemistry, and there was another graduate student I became friends with who was studying nucleic acids. I wondered what those are. Well, that was DNA. That was this. Boy, this is, I'm sorry, I'm going to keep doing this. This is DNA, and that's what he was studying. And it was a remarkable experience for me to realize I totally missed all of the excitement that was happening in biology because I'd gotten so narrowly focused on physics and chemistry. It was the only thing that I really wanted to do. And I was concerned that maybe life science was too messy for me. Well, it is messy, but it's fascinating. And here it is. The information molecule of all living things, carrying that information in this double helical structure, basically on the basis of a language that just has 4 letters in its alphabet. In this case, there are 4 chemical bases. We abbreviate them A, C, G, and T. And every living thing depends on that to pass along information down through the generations, and it has to carry within it all of the information necessary to take a human being as a single cell and turn that person into one of you. We all did that at one point. This particular genome, as it's called, with its 3 billion letters of the DNA code, was apparently sufficient to have all the biological properties of a human being encoded there so that that could play out and give rise to just an amazing organism with the most complicated structure in the known universe, the human brain, somehow guided by those directions. And I was just totally stunned to think about that. I'm still totally stunned thinking about that. So I kind of had to figure out, what does this mean for my own future? Is it time for me to rethink my pathway? And I felt like I really want to do this kind of science. I've got a great foundation now in chemistry and physics, but I want to do something that's closer to life science. And ideally, I'd like it to go all the way to be something that might have a more direct application to human beings. So here I am, I'm a third-year graduate student, I'm married and I have a small child, and I decided I'm going to go to medical school. A bit of a shock to wife, parents, everybody around me, but it felt like a calling. Amazingly enough, the admissions committee at the University of North Carolina thought that was a good enough reason to let me in. Somebody who had never thought about being a physician until I'm like 20 years old, and now it's my calling. What they believed it, they accepted it, and they let me in. And it was exactly what I had been looking for, because it was this rigorous kind of digital science. That's a digital code. There's mathematics here, plenty of it, but it's also highly relevant to some of the major questions that we are all struggling with. How does life happen? How did disease happen? What can we do about it? And that's what I wanted to do. So I got trained in internal medicine. I'm that kind of a doc, and went off and then did an additional fellowship to learn the research side of molecular biology and how that might be applied to human disease, and ultimately ended up as a faculty member at the University of Michigan, called Blue. And I knew I wanted to try to do something to uncover answers to some of the diseases that I saw as a physician, particularly when interested in genetics, but for which we really didn't have much to go on in terms of what was the cause. So it's 1984. At that point, cystic fibrosis was the most common disorder I would see in the clinic, and it was heartbreaking. These kids, sometimes making it to adolescent, rarely getting much beyond that, afflicted by these chronic infections in the lungs and limited survival. And we really didn't understand much about what the disease was really caused by, other than it ran in families. So maybe it would be possible to actually find what must be a misspelling in DNA that would cause this. And that's what I set about doing, even though at the time it seemed pretty unfeasible. And it was really difficult and frustrating. And people would ask me, so are you making any progress? Have you found it yet? And I would say, well, no, but it's a hard problem. And they would say, well, how hard is it? And I finally decided I need a visual image. So I got a picture taken of myself in a Michigan haystack. holding up a needle. That's how hard it is. I don't know if anybody's impressed, but at least it was another answer to the question. But ultimately, after working on this for 4 or 5 years, it seemed like we were making some progress, but it was so slow. And there was another group in Toronto that was also pursuing the same answer. What's the cause of cystic fibrosis? But we were kind of competing with each other, and it didn't seem to make much sense. Hey, if this is hard, maybe we should just do it together. So I got hold of him. He said the same thing. Why are we doing this separately? And we just merged our labs. And we met for lab meetings in a rundown Holiday Inn in London, Ontario, which is sort of halfway in between. And things really started to make sense. What he was doing and what we were doing, they were quite complementary. And to the great relief of us, it worked. And in 1989, we were able to announce we have discovered the cause of cystic fibrosis. Out of those 3 billion letters in the human DNA instruction book, just 3 letters, a CTT, was missing in a gene that nobody had ever noticed before on chromosome 7, and almost 90% of people with cystic fibrosis have that issue. I can jump forward right now with a source of great joy and tell you that those 90% of cystic fibrosis individuals now have access to a treatment, a drug called Trikafta, that is nothing short of miraculous. And those kids who were planning, at best, maybe to have a chance for some life before an early funeral are now thinking about, what will I do when I retire? Because of the key. Michigan, I worked on a couple of other conditions. This is Nancy Wexler, somebody who's here knows Nancy Wexler, because we worked together trying to find the gene that causes Huntington's disease, which is affecting many families, including her own. I met with Nancy about a month ago. She is now herself affected with this disease. We don't yet have an answer to it, but we're making progress. And we found the gene for a disease called neurofibromatosis, which has not gotten much attention, but is actually much more common than cystic fibrosis and muscular dystrophy. And there again, the gene discovery then leads you in the direction of finally having something you can go on in terms of designing a therapeutic. And most recently, although it's now a 20-year effort, my lab's been working on this condition. This is Sam Burns in the middle with me and Cookie Monster. And Sam is affected with a disease called progeria, the most rapid and dramatic form of premature aging. Sam is 15 in that picture. He died just about a year later of a heart attack. And most of these kids, until recently, have been dying of heart attacks and strokes in their age 12 to 13, maybe 15. We're able to understand this one by finding its cause, figuring out there was a drug that had been developed for cancer that didn't work for cancer but has just the right properties for this disease. And it just came back a week ago from an international workshop on progeria, and there were multiple individuals with progeria in their 20s, which we've never seen before. But it's not good enough. We really ought to be able to do better than that with the new developments, particularly with CRISPR, with gene editing. All of these kids have one letter that's misspelled, a T that should have been a C. And we now have editors that know how to find and fix that in the heart. And that's what we're going to try to do within the next year for somebody with progeria. Now, progress right now is just breathtaking in terms of what's possible, which makes it particularly difficult that here in the US anyway, the support for that progress is having a tough year. And I'll come back to that in a bit. So I was having a great time doing all this research at the University of Michigan, and then the Human Genome Project was getting talked about. Maybe we could get there a lot quicker, understanding all of these conditions, including some really hard problems that aren't inherited in such straightforward ways, if we actually had a reference copy of the human genome, and we didn't have to keep inventing little bits and pieces along the way. And that was the idea for the Human Genome Project. I was a big fan of it when it got started in 1990 under the direction of none other than James Watson, who, with Francis Crick, discovered that double helical structure back in 1953. It seemed very poetic to now have him in charge. And it got off to a good start because he was a rock star, but it got in trouble because he was a rock star and didn't always mind what he said to whom. And after he insulted the director of the NIH a few too many times, he was suddenly gone. And then my phone rang. And it was the director of the NIH saying, I think you should apply for this because we need somebody to come and get this baby in a crib, which the Genome Project was at that point, getting started, and see if we can help it grow up and actually succeed. And you're a doc, which is good because we want somebody who's thinking about the medical parts. And I said, you gotta be crazy. This is not me. I'm happy in Ann Arbor. I'm doing the things I've always dreamed of. And you're asking me to become a federal employee? That was part of the package, after all. So I said no, but then I struggled with the no. I came back to NIH for something else, and Bernadette Healy, who was the NIH director, asked to see me, and I thought, oh, here we go. She's going to be a hard sell again. And she made a pitch to me that I was so unprepared for, and which I will always thank her for because it really helped me understand what the issue was. She was giving me the pitch. This is the greatest job. There's only going to be one genome project. You're going to be the one to push it right to the finish line. And I was like, very defended. I'm not listening. And she finally stopped in the middle of the sentence and she said, Francis, I don't think I'm getting through to you. I have to admit she's right about that. She said, you know, I've got this little vision right now. It's a few decades from now, and I'm Bernadine, and I'm walking down the hall in my assisted living home with my walker. And I look down the hall, and what do you know? Here comes somebody towards me, and he's got his walker. And he comes up next to me. Oh my gosh, Francis, it's you. And you know what you say to me right then? You say, I should have taken that job. Nailed me. Because that's exactly the sort of back of my mind feeling I've been having about you're about to walk away from something you will regret for the rest of your life. The chance to be able to lead something this meaningful and historic. And I went back home, thought about it overnight, and called her the next day and said, okay, when do I start? And that was 1993. And amazing things happened then over the course of the next 10 years as the Human Genome Project accomplished happily with the amazing contributions of a group of over 2,000 scientists that I had the chance to try to manage and lead and try to encourage to work together in ways that some of them hadn't done before, and also to have really clear goals and be sure the data we were producing was all of the highest quality. I won't walk through all these milestones. It wasn't like we started reading out the letters of the human genome on day one because our technology was completely not up to the task. First, we had to do a lot of technology invention, and then studying some similar organisms to be sure that we knew what we were doing, and then move on to the big one. And the big one finally did work. We were able to, in 2003, actually achieve all of the goals that had been set for the original Genome Project. And those are the folks there in the big picture who contributed to that, but those are the leaders of these 20 research institutions in 6 countries. And then we had it the first time. Of course, it was 3 billion letters. You could look at it and it would be pretty hard for you to say, what am I reading here? We have a lot of work to do to try to understand how to be readers of this script. And that's something I then spent another 4 or 5 years working on at NIH as the director of the Genome Institute. And then, to my surprise, I got called to step up to be the director of the whole NIH in 2009. And that was not part of my life plan either, but it was an incredible privilege. And that meant I had to really expand my horizons in terms of what kinds of things I needed to know about and understand and be as visionary as possible about, most of which involved surrounding myself with other really smart people and giving them permission to be really creative. And to my surprise, I was there initially under President Obama. President Trump decided to keep me on for his 4 years, and then I stayed 1 more year with Joe Biden. That was 12 years, that was enough. And then I said, okay, somebody else needs to do this. But what an amazing ride that was. We got to do some pretty amazing things in that time. I got to start a whole center that would take a lot of the basic science that was still waiting for clinical applications and speed that up. NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. We started the BRAIN Initiative, which is now 10 years along, to try to really figure out how that amazing structure between your ears does what it does. And recruited a whole lot of scientists who were going to be working on this, to work on the brain, including a lot of engineers. And they're just the people we need to try to understand the surface. And started a program which maybe some of you might even be part of, called All of Us, inviting Americans to sign up, 880,000 have done so, to basically be part of a long-term study of how it is that the combination of genetics and environment and health behaviors and diet and exercise and all the other things around us figure out whether we're going to stay healthy or whether we're going to fall ill, and if so, what to do about it. This is precision health on the scale that you need to do precision health if you're really going to get the answer. So called All of Us. If you haven't already joined, it's not too late. Join allofus.org. There it is. And then some amazing therapeutic things started happening. We are curing sickle cell disease, the first molecular disease, which I studied as a postdoc way back when and thought, well, maybe someday in some future century, we'll actually do something for these people who suffer so mightily with the pain crises that are part of this. And now, again, with the amazing advances in genetics, and particularly things like CRISPR, we are curing sickle cell disease. Not as many people as we would like, so the next stage is to make it even more safe and more accessible and more affordable. We're going to get there. And then I did get asked, after I'd stepped out as NIH, to go and spend a year in the White House as the acting science advisor to the president. And that gave me a whole other bunch of insights about how science can be involved in circumstances that will turn out better if the scientific facts are there, including getting very engaged in a project, which I am still hoping our country will launch soon, which is to try to cure the 4 million people in the United States who are already infected with a disease called hepatitis C, for which we have an incredible cure, already FDA approved, 1 pill a day, 12 weeks, 95% cure, no side effects, but it's not getting to the people who need it because of our rather broken healthcare system. And it is so short-sighted for us not to do this because we are both causing people to suffer and we're paying incredible costs for the downstream consequences of hepatitis C in terms of liver failure and the need for a liver transplant. We could save the country $7 billion today if we just went out and found the people and got them cured. So, you can tell, we're real excited about this. We just need to get it done. So that's a bit of a run-through of some of my experiences as a physician, as a scientist. I hope you can see I've been incredibly fortunate and privileged to be engaged in things I never would have dreamed of as part of my pathway, and work with the most amazing people who all threw themselves into this with a determination to try to improve the human condition and succeeded in many ways in doing so. But then what about this Christian part? How's that fit in there? Well, how did that happen? I mentioned growing up, being homeschooled, faith was not part of the curriculum. I did get sent to the local Episcopal church to learn music, because I was a really good boys choir. And I remember my dad saying, don't pay too much attention to the rest of the just, learn to sight read and learn about harmony and all that. So I followed that instruction. By the time I got to college and into graduate school, I had slipped from being disinterested to being agnostic to being actually an atheist, and having this very materialistic view that there was nothing worth talking about that you couldn't measure scientifically. I was worshiping a particular religion called scientism, which is a priori decision that there's nothing outside of science. So once you've decided that's your prior, then religion is not worth talking about. And then, as you heard, I had this awakening that I wanted to change into life science. And that then led me to that medical school experience. And pretty soon I'm sitting at the bedside of people who have terrible diseases, many of them not because of their own actions, and many of them looking at what may be very limited time left. And I'm trying to imagine myself in that situation and not feeling very good about it. And some of these North Carolina patients seemed to be strangely at peace about what was happening, and they were the ones who were often mentioning their faith when I would talk to them. And I had one particular patient that I was very fond of, who was a grandmotherly individual with really bad heart disease. And in an afternoon where she had had a chest pain episode and gotten through it, she then shared her faith with me, as she had done several times before, and then turned and just asked me straight up, "No, doctor, I've shared my faith with you, and you never say anything. What do you believe?" Think about that, those 4 words. What do you believe? Is there any question that any of us have ever been asked that's more important than that? And I realized I have given 5 minutes thought to that. And here this honorable, caring, wonderful human being has called me out. And I'm sure I turned red and I stammered and I said, "I don't really know." And I saw this look of surprise in her face. Like, "You don't know what you believe?" And I ran out of the room. And I thought, that was really awkward. That was really uncomfortable. She basically pointed out to me that here's the most important question on which I have spent 0 time. And I'm a scientist. I'm supposed to make decisions based on evidence, and I've never given any interest in looking at the evidence. I better do something about this. I need to strengthen my atheism so this doesn't happen again. So what to do? So, there was no internet. It probably would have confused me if there was. But trying to figure out, what do people believe and why do they believe it? And I was pretty confused. And there was a pastor down the street from me on Old Hillsborough Road in Carver, North Carolina. A guy named Senator Millen, and I met him because he was out in his yard when I would walk by. I thought, well, I can go ask him. So I went and knocked on his door. He took me into his study. And I asked him a series of truly blasphemous questions because I needed to understand, how can you people believe this stuff? And he was very patient. He listened. He gave some suggestions of answers, but he said, you're on a journey here. This is not going to be solved in the next 30 minutes. But there are other people who have been on this journey too. And you might maybe learn something by seeing what they have done or written about. And so how about you take this little book on my shelf and see if it speaks to you? And that, of course, was Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis. I never heard of it. I took it home, sat down, opened it up, and in the first 3 or 4 pages, realized that my atheist arguments were those of a schoolboy. And they didn't stand up very well to the logic of this impressive Oxford Don, who I discovered had traveled the same path that I was on. That was alarming. I closed the book. It took me a while to have the courage to pick it up again. But I had to keep looking. Like, once starting down this pathway, I'm going to have to be able to answer that question. What do you believe? With something other than dismissiveness. So that journey led me in a bunch of interesting places. I talked to some of my medical school mentors who were Christians and tried to understand how can they put those 2 things together. Their very rigorous scientific medical side and this side that believes in the resurrection. You really believe that? And they would say, yes, I do. Okay, this is a stretch for me. I got to figure this out. And occasionally I would realize that my atheist perspective was looking thinner because there were certain aspects of what I knew about in science that were actually not very compatible with the idea of atheism. There's some pointers to God in the very science that I had spent my last couple of decades working on. Like what, for instance? Well, the big one, there's something instead of nothing. Can science explain that? I don't think so. And that's curious, isn't it? Why should there be anything at all? And then I had studied physics and chemistry, and I had been in love with mathematical equations that explained the behavior of matter and energy. The Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism. All of the things that explain things like gravity or the structure of the atom. quantum mechanics, the second order differential equations that I'd study. I knew they were truth. Why? In Victor's phrase, there's an unreasonableness of mathematics. It's so effective. What is that about? If you were starting to be curious about a creator, then you might have to conclude the creator's a mathematician, because it works. It just works. Why should that be? And, of course, another big one, the fact that the universe had a beginning. So well established, 13.55 billion years ago, out of nothingness, with no ability for us to actually see further back than that. Nature has not been observed to create itself. This seems to require a different kind of creator that is not nature, or you haven't solved the problem. This creator would have to be outside of space and time, and capable of this kind of amazing mathematical idea to create a universe that would ultimately, with all of its parameters precisely set at the beginning, result in something as interesting as us being here tonight. Okay, and there's another part of that is particularly breathtaking, and that is what's called the fine-tuning of the universe. I didn't know about this until I read about it, and I'm still stunned by just how unlikely it is that our universe has anything interesting about it. Because in order for that to happen, all those mathematical equations, they have constants in them. Just take gravity, okay? What is the law of gravity? It says the force between two masses is mass 1 times mass 2 divided by r squared times the gravitational constant, big G. Theory doesn't tell you what the value of G should be. You have to go and measure it. And we know it now to a very precise level of specificity. So somebody asked a few decades ago, just for fun, suppose it wasn't that. Suppose a little bigger or a little smaller. And the answer was stunning. If it was even 1 part in a billion bigger than it is, 1 part in a billion, then the Big Bang would have led to a big crunch. Because the gravity would have pulled everything back together before we got here. If it was just a little bit weaker, there wouldn't be enough gravity to pull things together to create stars and galaxies and planets and just some boring particles flying apart forevermore. And that's not just gravity, that's all of the constants are in that same incredibly finely tuned space. If you can't look at that and say, no, it's just good luck. You're forced to one of two conclusions. And somebody said the dials. Sure sounds like that mathematician who wanted to be sure the outcome was a good thing. Or, if you're going to be a strict atheist, you have to say, well, there must be an infinite set of other parallel universes that have different values of those constants, but they wouldn't be a place where we would be. We have to be in the one place where it all worked. Will we ever be able to observe those other parallel universes? It seems no. So which of those options requires greater faith? It seems to me, Occam's razor, which is the way you're supposed to sort out two options and pick the one that is the most simple and straightforward, is kind of pointing to a greater God, not proof. But then that gets you to deism, doesn't it? This is Einstein's God I just described to you, that the universe is finely tuned, beautiful, mathematical, had a beginning, there must be some purpose here in terms of it. But does God care about us? Did God care about Albert Einstein? Does God care about you? How do we get into that thing called theism? That was a big challenge for me, and Lewis helped me a lot. Lewis helped me with that first chapter of Mere Christianity, which is called Right and Wrong, as a clue to the meaning of the universe. What? But think about it. It's the sort of thing you just take for granted as you're growing up, that everybody knows there's something called right and wrong, and we're supposed to do the right thing. And every society that we know anything about has had that same sense. And you can call that the moral law. Now, societies will make a different view about what belongs in the right column and what belongs in the wrong column, depending on cultural traditions, but they don't disagree that there's a right and a wrong, and you ought to do the stuff that's right and avoid the stuff that's wrong. And when we do the stuff that's wrong, what do? We try to make an excuse, which only says we believe in the moral law, and we're trying to say we didn't really break it. Where does that come from? There are folks who would try to put that completely into an evolutionary perspective, that this kind of moral imperative has helped us survive. It's improved our reproductive fitness. But that falls apart pretty readily when you start looking at things like radical altruism, where people actually put their own lives at risk for other people they don't even know. Because while evolutionary processes might allow you to be sacrificial for your own kin because they share your DNA, so you're helping propagate that, or even for the group that you're part of, although that's a bit of a stretch, it also requires you to be hostile to the outward. And when we most admire human noble actions, it's when somebody was sacrificial to the outward. Oskar Schindler putting his life at risk to save Jews from the Holocaust. What about that? And of course, Jesus as the most dramatic example of radical altruism, dying on the cross. I can't get morality squared without some other source than pure evolutionary sociobiology. I just can't get there. And I find that extremely compelling. Okay, if you go with me, if that says there's a God who developed all of the amazing parts of the universe to make it possible for complicated, interesting things to happen, including big-brained creatures that would begin to search for him. And if one of the goals there was for us to recognize that morality is a calling to us, and yet we're failing at it, we're in trouble. I thought at the time, I'm in trouble. I'm just beginning to appreciate the possible existence of a holy God, and I'm realizing how unholy I am. And just as I would want to maybe have a relationship with God, he seems to be receding and turning into a judge. And then I figured out what Jesus was all about. I never understood. I never really understood growing up that Jesus was a historical figure. I thought this was a myth of some sort. And finding out that the evidence of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is not as strong as anything we have from 2,000 years ago, much stronger than, say, what we know about Julius Caesar. And then it made sense, because my unholiness can still have the opportunity to be in a relationship, and a loving relationship, with a holy God, because Jesus died for me, covered me with the blood, so that I can, white as snow, have access to Almighty God. Jesus died for my sins. Those words, when I was growing up, if I heard them on the street corner, I was like, oh, that just makes no sense. Now it made most perfect sense. And I was on a hike in the Cascade Mountains, Oregon and Washington State, and I felt I could no longer resist. And turning a corner and seeing a perfectly beautiful natural scene of a frozen waterfall, I felt the resistance drop away. I couldn't go back to where I was. I had to go forward. I fell on my knees. I said, okay, that's it. I'm ready to take that leap, even though I don't know what I'm leaping into. I was 27. That was a long time ago, but that has been the rock of my life ever since. That I can find, no matter what the circumstances are, that God is still there as the foundation, even when everything else seems to be going wrong. And what a gift for this skeptical young man that woman asked me, what do you believe? Now I have an answer. I believe and what we spoke at Evensong in the Apostles' Creed, and a whole lot more beyond that as well. And there's one other thing that I more recently have begun to appreciate as a signpost to God, and that's this thing called beauty, which I hadn't thought about so much. Somehow that's coming more into my consciousness. Why is it that beauty matters to us? Why is it, for me particularly, it's beauty of something like a musical piece? If you play for me the second movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, I'm going to lose it, because it is just so beautiful, so powerful. It's like this aching poignancy that what Lewis talks about, joy, this the sense that I was made for something more than this. And as soon as you've experienced it, it kind of slips away, but it's that little glimpse of what we are really called to become. So Judy's in there too. And then I began to realize, taking my new faith and bringing it back to science, it both makes the mathematics more exciting and beautiful. It also makes some of the things you do in the lab beautiful. Look at this. On the left is one of those beautiful stained glass windows. This happens to be York Minster. There's one like that in many churches. But on the right, that's DNA, but looked at down the long axis instead of from the side like we did. Isn't that beautiful? There's beauty all around us in the practice of science. And if you stop and think about that, it means that when you're in the laboratory, you're actually engaged in worship. You're having the opportunity to perceive that beauty and to see the elegance of what God gave us with this gift. So the God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. Worshiping in the cathedral, yeah, also in the lab. And creation is majestic, awesome, intricate, and beautiful. And that's what I wrote about 19 years ago in this book called Language of God. So I've told you my story of how I became a scientist, and told you my story about how I became a Christian, and I have not found, in the last 47 years, a circumstance where those are in conflict. And they exist in my own experience simultaneously. It's not like they're pushed off in separate corners. And that still seems to surprise a lot of people in our society where these are considered to be in conflict. I have not found that to be the case. And in fact, I found this a wonderful opportunity to feel fully alive, fully able to ask all the questions because of having those worldviews experienced in my own life. But now let me turn to something about our current circumstance and more of what's in this book called The Road to Wisdom. And I have to, as sort of background from that, because it's what drove me ultimately to write the book, talk about the experiences we have all had in the last 5 years. And that is with COVID-19. Most of us probably try not to remember too much about those first few months of 2020. When the articles started to appear that there's something going on in Wuhan, and initially the Chinese were not very straightforward about it, and so we did not know how serious it was for a while. But it was pretty clear to my colleagues and myself at NIH that this was something to take very seriously. On January 10th of 2020, the actual letters of the genome of SARS-CoV-2, of the virus that causes COVID-19, were posted on the internet by a courageous Chinese scientist. And the design of the vaccine, that became the Moderna vaccine, which many of you probably got in your arms, I did, was done in the next 48 hours. This was like completely all hands on deck. The first phase 1 trial was started in just 63 days. The phase 3 trials were underway fully by July. And those involved recruiting 30,000 participants for each of the vaccines. Half of them got the real vaccine, half got a dummy shot, and they didn't know which one they got, and neither did the people giving the shot. This was all done with a barcode. And only after a few months went by where you could see what happened would you know whether the vaccine was working in the real world. And fortunately, though most vaccines fail, this one had a pretty remarkably positive outcome. Settled science about the vaccines? Well, first of all, more than 1 million Americans died of COVID-19, and you know that. The vaccines were developed and tested rigorously in 11 months. The double-blind trials, when they were de-blinded, showed serious side effects were quite rare with 30,000 people. And the efficacy with that original virus, before it started mutating, was 92 to 95% in preventing serious disease and saving lives. Now, we did find out later, once we had immunized 300 million Americans, there's this rare side effect of myocarditis with the mRNA vaccines in young males, about 1 in 10,000. Happy to say that's reversible. As far as I've been able to discern, that did not result in any deaths. But a lot of things began to happen there in terms of information that was circulating suggesting maybe there were really serious side effects from the COVID-19 vaccine I'm sorry to say, those got spread much more rapidly than the evidence should have made that happen. The evidence from the Commonwealth Fund is that 3 million lives in the United States alone were saved by these vaccines, and maybe 20 million in the world. But more than 230,000 unvaccinated people in the United States died between the summer of 21 and the spring of 22, during a time where vaccines were freely available to anybody who wanted them. Because by the summer of 21, we already were in this circumstance of considerable distrust. People weren't sure whether the vaccine was safe. Was it rushed? Was there something in there you hadn't been told about? Is it perhaps, is there a chip in that syringe? Does this make you sterile? Is it possible that there are fetal body parts in here? All of those rumors are spreading around. Some people from the religious community even equating this, might this be the mark of the beast? And we should stay away from it. And so more than 50 million Americans at that point said no. That was hard to understand and heartbreaking to see it happen. When I'd been in the midst of all this, and I was totally convinced by the data with no reason to promote it other than trying to save lives. And yet, that information did not convince a lot of people. And so, again, this is Kaiser Family Foundation. 230,000 people died in that 9-month period who didn't need it. So if there was a diagnosis here that our culture wars had gotten into a really dangerous place, here it was. I was deeply troubled about that. And when I stepped down from NIH in December of 21, I felt like, I need to understand this. How did this happen? I knew that we were not getting along very well. I didn't know it could be this tragic. So, what about that? Let's look at the current state of our nation and our world, and it's in 2 words. America's divided. That's not news to any of you, I'm sure. More in Common, which is a group that studies societies, started in the UK and then they came here, kind of divides people up into various categories, and in this instance, based on political leanings. And they have these 7 different groupings. And they point out that the extremes are mostly the ones that get the attention. They're vocal and they have a lot to say, and some of it is scary. And we know that scary information spreads a lot more rapidly than something reassuring. But they also make the point that maybe 2/3 of Americans are not in those areas, and they're really in what they call the exhausted middle, or the exhausted majority, who are just like, what happened to us? And a lot of those people, and I think probably a lot of us feel like we're part of that, are kind of like checked out. Like, okay, this is crazy. I'm just going to try to go ahead and live my life. But somehow, we have to figure out how that happened and what to do about it. Other things have been determined in terms of the way in which these extremes happen. If you're in one of the extreme perspectives, you are likely to look at people on the other side as much more radical than they are. That's part of what our polarization, our affective polarization has done to us. And you're also unlikely to be satisfied with an outcome where it's not good enough that you got the right answer. They have to get punished because they got the wrong answer. It's sort of like the New Yorker cartoon where the dogs are having cocktails and it's not enough to say we succeed, the cats must also pay. Kind of funny, but it's kind of terrible. You can see that right now. Look at the way we're arguing about the shutdown. It's not enough that one party has to win and say, yeah, we got it right, the other one has to fail. That's where we are. This is such an unproductive, destructive way to try to make societal progress. So how do we get here? Well, I would say many of our traditional anchors have been gradually eroded and maybe even lost. Truth. Is there really such a thing? You can encounter people who don't really accept that anymore. Aren't we postmodern now? Is it okay for me to reflect on a fact that you just offered me and say, well, it might be true for you, but it's not true for me, when it's an established fact? No, it's not okay. I don't understand why people belong to the Flat Earth Society, but thousands of people do. That's not okay. We have an established bit of evidence here. But we are slipping in that regard. And that is a diagnosis for the future of our society that's not good. So we've got to come back to our anchoring of truth. And part of that is science, because science is the way that we discern truth about nature. But there's a lot of skepticism, and some of it is very justified. Science makes mistakes. And yes, the good news is science is self-correcting. If science has claimed anything that matters, it's going to get checked and rechecked. And if it was wrong, we'll figure that out. If science has established something, and it has been checked and checked and rechecked, and it turns out everybody agrees, well then that's an established fact. And it's okay to say, I believe that one. But we're getting kind of blurry about that as distrust in science has grown rapidly. And what about faith? Do you think people of the Christian faith would be in the best position as people of love and truth, not to try to address the way in which our society has gotten so devoid in truth and devoid in love? But I think many Christian communities have also gotten caught up in a lot of the rhetoric, and a lot of it is political, and that has not been a way for churches to be the kind of coming back together that we need. And then the fourth issue is trust, and it's sort of actually engaged in all of these areas. Why is trust in individuals and institutions slipping across the board? It is slipping dramatically. I'll show you a diagram in a minute. It's sort of, some of that's earned, but some of it is manufactured. And some of it is our just overall, as we become more polarized, we become more cynical. And that means that any institution is immediately questioned about whether they're on the take, or whether they know what they're doing, or whether they really care about it. All of those things are contributing to our current circumstance. And you notice those are also the subtopics to the book, The Road to Wisdom. If you want wisdom, you kind of have to get these things back in the right place. Let me just say a little bit more about each of these four areas, maybe in ways that will help. Truth again, the critical need for clarity about the evidence for a claim. And I've been talking about this, but this diagram helps me a bit, maybe it will help you. That when we're having an argument about something that relates to truth, it's really important to keep in mind, where are you on this circle? Necessary truth in the middle is very simple things like mathematics. 2 plus 2 is going to be 4, no matter what university you're in. But the next circle out that firmly established facts, those are things like the fact that the earth is round and not flat. And those are places where the facts don't care how you feel, and it's not all right just to say, well, I don't believe that one because I don't like it. And then you get a little further out, and you've got areas of uncertainty. That's good. We should work on those. Try to figure out if we can make them certain and move them in a little bit. And all the way out, we have opinion. Do men who wear brown leather shoes with white soles look good in them? There's a disagreement at my house about that. But I don't think it's disrupting our marriage, nor do I think it's going to disrupt society if we have those kinds of opinion issues and don't have to find a result. But think about it. A lot of the time when we get in a mess, it's because somebody has an opinion and they're determined it's truth and you have to believe it too. Or the other way around, there's an established fact and they don't like it. And so they're going to tell you, I don't have to believe that. And that's not true for me. To the extent that we make those mistakes categorically and across the board, we are really risking the opportunity to flourish as a society. Truth really matters. But why do we have such trouble with this? I guess, again, being a scientist, I'm all about truth. And so Descartes was kind of my philosophical touchstone back in the days when I was a worshiper of scientism. I think, therefore I am. I'm a rational actor. Give me the facts, I'll make the right decision. I used to think that. David Hume came along a little later and had a much more realistic view of this, albeit an atheistic view. The reason is, and not only to be the slave of the passions. Mom, me, do I have what? Reason is the slave of the passions? That can't be true. Think about it. If somebody gives you a fact that absolutely does not fit with your own personal worldview, you're going to be very resistant, even though the fact is really compelling, because you're going to have a passionate reaction to that. I kind of like a better way of saying this, which is Blaise Pascal. The heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing of. Yeah, okay, I I'll give you one more philosopher that's less well known, with quite a handle here, Willard Van Orman Quine. And he wrote about the web of belief. And I'm going to show you this as an image, and maybe it'll help you because it's helped me. We all have a web of belief. Think about this. A spider's web, in order to be able to hold together, it's got all these threads. But there's some that are really important in the middle, and those nodes where the threads come together have to be stable, or the whole thing's not going to last very long. So imagine that that's your web of belief, and you have to place on that web various things that you believe. And the ones that you're really sure of are going to be right in the middle, and the ones that are a little further out, well, I might consider changing my mind on those. Imagine doing that for yourself. I'll show you mine. Science is trustworthy. I'm sorry, I'm not going to give that one up. My wife loves me. I have no reason to give that one up. I'm really quite sure of that. I don't know. Some days, yeah, other days. And yeah, they came to me and said, actually, your cat has been getting fed and patted next door. Wouldn't be shocked. Jesus died for me. Yeah, that's the center of who I am as a Christian. That's a core. And I'm not going to give that up, no matter what kind of evidence you bring me, unless I'm going to get anything with the evidence you do. The resurrection is true. I believe that. I know for a scientist, yeah, but if it's God, and God decided to suspend the laws of nature for God's Son to rise from the dead, well, sure. That's unbelievably amazing. Other things maybe less sure about, like premillennialism is correct. I don't know. It's a little further out there. Rudy Birdie, you can help me with that later. More health things. Vaccines are safe and effective. You notice I didn't put that all the way in the middle because some vaccines aren't entirely safe and some of them aren't entirely effective. It depends on the situation. Is getting the vaccine a better bet than getting the disease? That's sort of the question. So let's be fair. Public health needs experts, yes, but it also needs the public. I don't think we had enough of that during COVID. The CDC is always right. No, I'm afraid. I love the CDC. They're my friends. They've been through hell lately, but basically, they've made mistakes too. Mandating masks in schools were essential. I don't think it probably was. Although we did at the time everything we could do to try to save lives. I'm not sure how effective this one was, but it was a crisis. Climate change is real, folks. It breaks my heart to see how that has suddenly slipped off the radar as something that we should be, in this country, leading to try to address, because our planet is in trouble. And we are people, we're supposed to be stewards of creation. And that requires a lot more than what I see happening. And I'll put that in there. And here's one that I think also, although it's not popular to talk about, structural racism, the effects upon our society, the fact that we had slavery in this country 400 years ago, it still has its reverberations. We have to look at that. Maybe it's, the term bothers people, but the reality is real. So that's a little bit about truth. Now science develops hypotheses. So by the way, that's my lab group, or it was my lab group. And I was made unwelcome at NIH and departed on February 28th. But the group is still there, working on diabetes and also that rare form of premature aging called porphyria. I am worried about where we are with science. A slight little detour here in terms of the U.S. This has been such a triumph of our country. We have led the world for decades in making medical breakthroughs. And that has been because of the health of this remarkable ecosystem that involves basic science, mostly funded by NIH, the federal government through your tax dollars, and the biotech industry and the best universities on the planet, all working together to make discoveries and then bring them forward for clinical benefits. But all that right now is at risk. Our record is stunning, but the current circumstance with budget cuts and grant terminations and research universities under threat means that that kind of progress can't be counted on. And most Americans, I don't think, have a good sense about how those breakthroughs were happening before and why this might not be something that's a good turn of events. So one of the things I'm doing right now is to try to organize an effort to create what I would call a story bank of people whose lives have been touched in amazing ways by medical research. An adult with cystic fibrosis who's living a normal life. Somebody with stage 4 cancer who thought, well, that's it, and is now in remission, maybe even cured by immunotherapy. All those things are now possible, but I'm not sure everyday Americans have heard of them. So wouldn't it be good to have hundreds of these authentic patient stories from people who are not experts, not seen as elitists, but just everyday folks who have been able to testify about why this is a noble and important American activity and ought to go forward and flourish and not be put in such a difficult place. I'm trying to do what I can in that space. So we did truth, we did science, we have faith, which we've already talked about, which ought to be answering questions that science can help with and should be an anchor in the current storm, and Christians should be in the best position to advocate against all this divisiveness and in favor of love, grace, and truth. How are we doing? Really? I mean, the Christian calling is all about what we need right now. Not just loving your neighbor, but loving your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That must have stunned people listening to Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount. And they stun us today. Love your enemies. How are we doing on that? I have to keep talking to myself about that. And also, words of Jesus. Truth. If you hold my teaching, you're really my disciples, then you will know the truth. And the truth will set you free. We are about truth as followers of Jesus. And then there's this sort of scary bunch of verses in Proverbs that maybe we ought to think of. There's 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. Wow. I need to say more than that. Clearly, our society has fallen into some of those traps. Finally, trust. This is the diagram I mentioned I would show you. This is done by the Gallup organization every year since 1977. They've been recording what is the public's view of trust in various institutions. And what's happened since 1977 and the most recent data from 23 is this dramatic shift to the left, those red arrows. The line there in the middle is 50%. So there's nothing now above 50% except the military. And some things have gotten way down in the basement. I'm sorry, Congress. You seem to be, in this diagram anyway, at the lowest level. About 7% of the public has trust. Some of this is warranted, but some of it is this general skepticism, cynicism about everything. We need institutions. We will not, as a society, be able to flourish without them. We want them to be successful and effective. But if you want to tear them all down, that's called anarchy. And that is not going to be the kind of way you want to live. So what is going on here? How did this happen? And how did we as individuals find it so difficult now to figure out where to apply our trust? We're barraged by sources. Some of them probably don't deserve being trusted. Some of them do, but we're skeptical about them. How do we decide? So I had to think about this. And I actually think there are 4 factors, whether you are thinking about it or not, that you are using when you're trying to decide whether to trust a source. Does that source have integrity? Are they honorable? Are they competent? Do they know their stuff? Have they done the work to actually have the expertise to give you an answer that's not just an opinion? And are they humble? Are they willing to say, okay, this is the best answer I've got, but it might be wrong? Or is it like, I understand this completely and perfectly, and you can trust me on everything, even outside of the question you asked? Be very careful when that happens. And then there's this 4th one, aligned values. I think traditionally we've always looked for sources that were aligned with our values. That's sort of a natural thing, because, okay, they're thinking like me. But now, when our aligned values tend to be attached to the particular tribal alliance that we have landed in, which is often political, that may be turning into a trend. I mean, think about it. If you have a particular group of folks who think like you do, particularly about political issues and controversies, and there's that other group over there that's very different, you're now more and more likely to think that other group is actually a little dangerous. Suppose somebody in that other group has a really word of truth that you need to hear. Are you going to listen to it? And suppose somebody in your group has something that they just read on the internet that sounds sort of plausible. They said, you need to do this, you need to bring this into your own store of knowledge. And it's actually not very well founded, but it's your group. So, okay, maybe I'll go with that. So the problem is, aligned values has sort of taken over. And our traditional methods of paying attention to integrity, competence, and humility kind of got squeezed a bit off to the side. There's a whole book that's very sobering called The Death of Expertise. Experts now are automatically seen as suspicious, which is weird. If your car breaks down, you're going to go to a mechanic that you think knows how to take care of your car. That's an expert. But when it comes to something a little less familiar, and sometimes that's science and sometimes that's public health, experts are immediately like, I don't know, I'm going to do my own research. I have a coffee cup, which I'm not proud of, but it was given me by somebody who thought I would get a laugh at it, which says, please do not confuse your Google search with my medical degree. It's a little snotty, but you kind of see this. So I'm running a little late, but let me try to wind this up. How do we find our way back? One thing to give a diagnosis here, but how do we find our way into a better place as far as our society? Well, first of all, let me say, don't expect that solution to come from politics, at least not right now. Our politicians are more polarized than we are. And I don't think the media is helping very much either. So it's kind of we the people. It's up to us to figure out. And that sounds tough, and maybe not that easy to scale to the whole country, but it's got to start there. So what could you do? Re-anchor your worldview, if you're a believer. The biblical principles. There's so much discordance between what the political actions are saying we should do and what the Bible says we should do. Which one do you want to put your faith in? Again, this issue of trust. Develop an intellectual radar to do a better job of distinguishing facts from fakes so that you're not taking on board things from social media or cable news that are really not true, even though they make you angry or fearful or something, and they tend to capture your imagination. Don't fall into that trap if this is just another opinion from somebody who doesn't have those qualifications of integrity, competence, and humility. We gotta learn how to talk to each other again. Thanksgiving is coming. There's so many jokes about, well, I don't know, Thanksgiving is going to be tough because that uncle, I can say, well, maybe we could. Maybe we can really try. And I've learned about this through an organization called Braver Angels, which I'm part of. And they basically have made a real effort to develop the kinds of frameworks that allow you to sit with somebody who completely disagrees with you about something and actually listen to each other and learn something about each other and come away not necessarily agreeing, but at least not demonizing. We could do a lot more of that. This guy down here in the corner, that's Will Wilkinson, runs a trucking company in Minnesota. And when I first got engaged with him about Braver Angels, he hit me with every possible argument that public health was broken and that we did everything wrong during COVID. And I thought, I'm never going to be able to be in the same room with this guy. I mean, we're good friends. I still think he's wrong about stuff. He thinks I'm wrong about stuff. But we understand each other, and he has helped me rethink some of the ways that I had approached COVID from the perspective of what it was like in the heartland. We need to keep doing more and more of that. We got to help the kids because they're in particular difficulty right now with social media, especially. If you haven't read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, it will shake you up, and then sign up to his Substack, and it will shake you up more. We have got to do something to help rescue, particularly girls in adolescent periods where social media is doing so much harm and very, very good. And then we can not only have one-on-one conversations with people we don't agree with, but find community opportunities for dialogue. Maybe this is one we're having tonight. And churches can be a place for this kind of healing if they have the courage to actually tackle some hard problems and not worry that that's just going to cause too much distress. We have to start talking about it. Yeah, it would be good if our national leaders represented the kind of character, vision, and causative action. Although, again, I don't think that's where we're going to start this process of healing. And finally, maybe even if you're interested, think about whether you would want to pledge personal action to get engaged in this, as opposed to, well, that was nice, and going back to where things were. And it's a bit bold, I suppose, in this book to suggest that people might want to do this, but if you get to the last chapter, you will see this pledge, and it has statements about how you will be a part of the solution to divisiveness instead of part of the problem, how you're going to seek out opportunities to engage in dialogue with people with different views by listening to them, and how you will be a wise consumer and do that sifting to tell the difference between facts and fakes, and resist the temptation to spread information that turns out to be wrong. That's part of our problem. Things circulate so quickly, especially if they make you angry. Something goes viral, you can be pretty sure it's not true because it usually isn't, but you shouldn't want to be part of that. And of course, bring the generous spirit. Do what we should all do, but especially Christians. Don't ascribe evil intentions to others. Love your neighbor. That's the goal. So finally, how can you get wisdom? Well, not necessarily from this. Read the Bible, read Proverbs, read the book of James. This is two of my favorite verses. This, in this case, was artwork done by my daughter. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men generously and without reproach, and it will be given. James chapter 1, verse 5. And what is wisdom? I started out asking that question, and here's a much better definition than mine. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. If we could all find that kind of wisdom, we could recover our world, and we could really look to a time where we could worship our God in love and receive that love and grace back and have the chance once again to flourish. Thank you all.
Dr. Collins, that was phenomenal. Thank you so much. If you, like me, were thinking this is such a barrage of incredible wisdom, I wish I could take notes faster. We do have a bound copy of the notes. It's called The Road to Wisdom. It's available in a table in that back room with these daunting pictures of former rectors of the church. So there's some note cards in your seats or next to your seats, and if you'd like to write down a question for Dr. Collins, we have some runners who can grab them from you if you're handing them up. And if you have a really important question that you really need him to answer, I will tell you the secret to getting the question read. It's penmanship. So if I can't read your question, no dice. Seeing none, I thought I might ask you, as cards are being collected, so in your book you talk a little bit about, and in your talk you talked a bit about this idea of scientism, this idea that science itself says, I am here to comment on that which is observable, and others take the decision that if it's unobservable, it simply doesn't exist. What do you think the appeal of that worldview is, and why is it so prevalent?
I guess when I had that worldview, it was partly because I was threatened about the idea that anything important might not be achievable by science. If you're a scientist, you believe in the scientific method, you're tempted to expand that to be the only thing that matters. And I think most scientists also if they haven't gone through the process of really considering this what do you believe question, are of the general sense that their community of other scientists is not very friendly towards faith, and so maybe it's easier to just sort of put that one aside. And you sort of slip into scientism, not by so much choice, but by default, and by maybe not wanting to wrestle with murky questions that you don't feel very well prepared to deal with. But I think it's pretty straightforward. When I meet an absolutely strict atheist, I think I can make pretty good headway in convincing them that might be the least rational of the options. I mean, you're not, as a scientist, supposed to assert universal negatives. That's what is called the most dramatic and drastic dogma, is to assert, that's Chesterton's comment, and that's what an atheist is doing.
That's wonderful. And then as a kind of second piece, there's also the equal and opposite force of the Christian who reads page 1 of Genesis, sees the fiat lux, adds up the generations and says, October 26, 4004 BC, anything before that couldn't have been possible. Where do you think that impulse comes from?
I think that effort to try to understand the hermeneutics of the Bible is a noble impulse, and we've all had it as we try to make sense out of the scriptures down through the centuries. But I think it's a particularly American temptation, going back particularly 170 years ago, maybe particularly with the development of Darwin's theory of evolution, to be very attached because of some fear that this might be undergirding or upsetting the Christian perspective, that you have to adopt just one acceptable interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2. That would not be something Augustine would have approved of at all. He warns against that very thing. And you have to ask yourself, when you just read the scriptures, there are two descriptions in Genesis 1 and 2 of creation of humans, and they're different. So already you have to think, wait a minute, if we're going to call this ultra-literal, which one? And so a sensible reading of the scriptures would immediately lead you to the perspective that maybe this wasn't a science textbook. Maybe there's something much more important than that we should be getting out of this. But particularly in conservative American churches, beginning 100 years ago with the Scopes trial, that was exactly 100 years ago, in 1925, the trial of the century, which basically brought John Scopes up to be charged with having taught evolution, which was against the law in Tennessee. He was convicted and had to pay $100. But basically, what happened then became such a big event for the country. And William Jennings Bryan, who was the defender of the faith, was put on the stand himself, even though he was supposed to be one of the legal experts, and did not fare well in the cross-examination by Clarence Darrow. And it was embarrassing for the people of the church, and it was clearly a moment where they thought, these scientists and this evolution, this is out to get us. We've got to do everything we can to resist that. And 100 years later, that's still kind of reverberating. I gotta say, it's another part of the heartbreak. What group was most resistant to COVID-19 vaccinations when they became freely available with all the data to back them up? It was white evangelical Christians. I'm a white evangelical Christian. That's my people. And yet, the reverberations of Scopes, I think, were still there inside of those church communities.
It's really helpful. We have a lot of questions, so I hope you have several hours to spend with us. Loving your enemy is very hard. You said you're still working on it, too. Any advice?
Prayer. And I really mean that. Prayer for your own ability to understand how critical this is. And if you're not willing to give up that sense of animosity towards an enemy, then you're in trouble too. Then you're part of the problem. So yes, you don't have to pray, I think, for somebody who you believe is doing something morally wrong, to be like, okay, that's fine. But you have to pray for them because they're a child of God in God's image, just like you are, to find some truth that maybe will help that person find God or find some version of God. And that's hard. It really is, because we are so tempted to slip into a place
of not being able to think of such individuals in our prayers as somebody we care about. We have to do that. I try to do that. Some days I'm better than others.
Another feeling. How would you respond to those who criticize CRISPR or gene therapy as playing God?
Great question. It sort of depends on what application you're talking about. So CRISPR, gene editing, allows you to kind of do with the genome what you do with your word processor. Where you say, oh, I've got a typo there. Find and replace that particular word, spell it properly. Genetic diseases are basically misspellings in the genome. That progeria disorder that I mentioned earlier is that one letter that was a T and should have been a C. If you could, for a child with that disease, go in and correct that and spare them a terrible outcome at a short lifespan of a heart attack or a stroke, I think that's entirely ethically defensible. We do these kinds of things in medicine out of benevolence. It sort of follows those principles of ethics that we've gotten pretty comfortable with. It's probably less drastic to do a gene editing than to do a heart transplant where it's somebody else's entirely heart, and we're comfortable with that. Where the ethical issues are is if you're talking about doing this on a human embryo to try to improve the future of our species. I am categorically opposed to that. I'm worried that there are increasing number of people who think, well, maybe we could try to do that. That is crossing, it seems to me, a line into a space that belongs to God and not to us. And we really wouldn't know what we would do in that space. So, right to raise the question, but keep in mind what the application. If you're curing sickle cell disease with CRISPR, I think that is right in the category of things that we are called to do as healers, just like Jesus taught us to do by the way he was a healer.
Do you anticipate the current anti-science, anti-research era will pass or will remain in the future of our society?
I wish I knew.
Yeah.
I want it to pass. I want these stories that I talked about of patients whose lives have been touched by medical advances to have people notice and go, wow, that might have been me or my family. Because this is a noble activity. And we're in such a dramatic time of potential advances. To lose those, to see lives lost unnecessarily when we had the chance to turn it around is just a heartbreak. But the current circumstance doesn't give me great confidence that that is going to be the kind of situation we can turn around very quickly. It's unprecedented. I've been a physician, scientist now for many decades. I've been through transitions of various administrations and other kinds of political upheavals. Nothing that came close to this in terms of the systematic dismantling of the enterprise that has so much promise.
What do you think of recent research around epigenetics and how experiences influence gene expression?
A great question. Okay, somebody in here knows about epigenetics. So what is that? You know, that DNA that I showed you a picture of, those 3 billion letters, just think of that as a one-dimensional reading of letters. But it exists inside the cell, and you have the same genome in a liver cell and a brain cell, but they're doing very different things. Right? Which genes are on and which are off. And that's all the epigenetics part, where things come along and they bind to the DNA and say, this one ought to be active, and bind to this one over here and say, no, shut that one down. Or it gets methylated, or other kinds of changes happen. And your environment is a big part of how that gets influenced as well. What drug you take or the exposure you've got. Epigenetics is the way that influences how your genome is functioning at that point. So there's a lot there that we're learning. The whole field of epigenetics has just exploded. My own lab, when I was there at NIH, working on diabetes, it was mostly about epigenetics. What is it that causes one person with a genome that's pretty similar to tip over into diabetes and another person doesn't? A lot of it is all of those influences, diet, exercise, environment, and so on, that change the way in which the DNA is functioning and cause the cells in the pancreas in this person to be okay and the ones over here to kind of get exhausted.
How do you convince people who have proverbially incorrect facts at the center of their webs of beliefs?
talk to them, listen, try to understand the background, where that kind of perspective came from, resist the temptation to just walk away or be dismissive. These are all good, honorable people. They may have had information shoved into their portfolio of knowledge from unreliable sources without realizing. I may have some of those unreliable sources too without realizing. Yeah, just try to get to know that person and really, really take the time and listen so well that after they tell you their story, you can go back and say, here's what I heard you say. And they will say, yeah, that's what I said. The marriage counseling model. That's what we want.
How easy is it for you to do that when people have vitriol against your own beliefs, when they're angry about things that you care about, when they really differ from you? Do you still find the temptation to demonize them, or have you got to a point where you're really good at practicing that, just acceptance and listening?
If I can have a calm, civil conversation, I'm pretty good then. But if somebody is really angry and accusatory, and I got ambushed by Alex Jones in the Austin airport, so that would be a hard moment to have a good conversation. But most of the time, people are surprised when you say, "Oh, wait a minute, stop a minute, tell me why you came to that conclusion. I really want to understand." That's transformational. They expect you to be immediately on the attack. When you're not, they calm down as well.
I think, I'll get back to the cards, I promise, but I think societally we sort of have this sense that if I really disagree with you, and I think your position is dangerously wrong, and I spend time listening to you instead of yelling at you, I'm now part of the problem. How do we get past that?
Yeah, we are kind of in that zone. You get attacked for actually having a conversation with somebody on the other side. I've had that happen. When I first got involved with Bravery Angels and talking with the folks there who were extremely critical of the public health approach, and some of that ended up on streaming videos that a lot of people watched. Some of my own scientific colleagues were pretty critical about it. You're ruining our perspective by seeming so reasonable. Because we're guilty of this across the board. Let me just say, scientists have their own series of limits here in terms of practicing this idea of careful listening. We don't always do it either. So yeah, you just have to decide. It's a priority, and you have to stick with it, and don't expect that everybody will love you for it.
What do you think about experiments where scientists can stimulate the brain and create transcendent experience?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's a brain initiative I briefly mentioned is getting deeply into understanding how brain circuits work. There are more and more technologies that can tell you which circuit is being activated in a particular human experience. And we are learning about things that happen in the brain during deep meditation by people who are really well trained to be able to achieve those kinds of states. So that tells you there is sort of a neurological component of what is a fairly spiritual experience. And then you have to ask yourself the question, does that make the spiritual experience less important or more important? I think it's more important. I think if God wanted us to have a spiritual nature, it would make sense that God would have planned the whole process of how we develop to provide those circuits also in our lives to give us further opportunities to chase after that hunger that we all have to find something outside of the dailiness of our lives. So I think it's fascinating, and I think there's a lot that's going to happen there in the next 10 years as we begin to understand more and more about how spiritual experiences have an input in our brain's functioning. And I think, for me, that just makes it even more exciting.
That's fantastic. How does the urban-rural divide play, in your view, of these issues causing divisions?
Well, it plays in a big way. I think that was particularly painfully true during COVID. And here's a place where I will say, being in the middle of trying to make recommendations when thousands of people were dying every day, I think the general tendency of CBC and others of us who were often shoved in front of a camera to articulate what the recommendations were based upon the places where things were the worst. Just trying to save lives. When you saw the hospitals filling up, trying to flatten the curve. But if you were somewhere in a rural situation, you might not have even seen a case by then. And yet you were also told, you need to close your business, we need to close your schools. If we had a more robust public health system in 2020, if it hadn't already been decimated by underfunding over the preceding decades, we could have had a more locally driven decision process about how to handle this pandemic. We just didn't have it. Most local communities had very little in terms of public health expertise. And so, at least initially, we kind of had to do this in an across-the-board way. It wasn't a great fit for certain rural communities. And that added to their skepticism about what these folks from Washington or Atlanta were saying. Do they really know what it's like out here? And probably a lot of those statements didn't reflect that we did know what it was like. If we had it to do over again, which I hope we don't, I would hope we do a better job of trying to do this in a fashion that was more locally appropriate. But that would be part of the kind of expertise that doesn't exist in most local communities.
We're almost out of time. We have a bunch of cards left, but I'm just going to ask one selfish question of my own. And it's personal, so feel free to say, oh, it's 8:40. I really got to hit the road. I got to fly back to Bethesda. What's your own prayer practice like? And what are the kind of joys? What do you take from that? What's meaningful? And what are the challenges in prayer for you?
I don't think I'm a particularly good role model. I'm up most mornings at 4:30 or 5, and that is the moment to try to get anchored in Scripture and prayer before the rest of the day breaks forth. And I'm fairly faithful about that. Some days that prayer seems like it's really coming from the heart. Some days it feels like just turn the crank. And I think that's probably true for many of us. And then during the day, if there's something that I'm really struggling with, I will try to find a moment quietly to ask for some guidance. I don't hear answers to prayer the way some people do, but I feel like I'm getting some guidance, some insights that God is helping me sort through an issue that desperately needs that. And I would say music is another part for me where I find I can get closer to God sometimes with a musical catalyst. Maybe it's listening to a hymn, or maybe it's because I have a piano right around the corner from my home office, just sitting down at the piano and seeing what happens, because I don't always know, and feeling like, okay, I've got the connection. I can find a moment of peace in the midst of what seems like a very unpeaceful afternoon, because there are plenty of those. But it's all a bit dramatic. And I have a wonderful book club of other men who are serious believers, and they are such an anchor for me in terms of people you can completely reveal everything about your own faith walk and your professional life and have it accepted and be able to talk about what you're really troubled about yourself as well as what you think is going well. That anchor of those friendships just makes a huge difference.
Dr. Collins, this has been such a joy, such an honor to have you at St. Albans. Thank you so much for joining us.